Thank you so much, Julie. There we go. Zoom's told us it's being recorded now. And I'm really glad I didn't follow your instructions of clicking view and speaker view, because that means I've got to look at this. Because quite honestly, I don't know how many of you have heard me speak before. I know a couple of you would have done. I'm not the kind of person for slides and so on. So I'm just going to be sharing my journey, what I've learned about the franchising industry along the way, a couple of observations that I've had from working with some of the brands that we've worked with, and where I see some of the future around data management is going to be. So first things first, a couple of apologies. Whilst I am a chartered and a certified accountant, I've not done the books, I've not done the numbers for about 15 years, if not longer. So please, no tricky questions on numbers. But I do notice that Sue's in here, and Sue doesn't know that I was going to say this, but if you've got any tricky tax questions or accountancy questions, you can ask Sue. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I'm used to talking about some quite fluffy subjects for small business audiences. This one is going to be a bit more detailed. I might end up boring myself. So if you get bored, pop it in the chat and I'll move on quickly. So look, to first of all give you the background of how I fell into franchising, who I am, why I'm speaking here today. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Carl from D&T Chartered Accountants. We look after now over 100 networks, and I think it's 2,650 something clients as of October last year. We've not done the count this year. What we do is we provide franchise accountancy systems, a franchising dashboard to help franchisors and so on. But it was something that we stumbled across by accident. And back in 2004, one of my clients, who was a martial arts school, talked to me about franchising. And he was talking about how this amazing business model could make him millions and he wouldn't have to do anything and life would be so easy. I attended a franchise show with him. I realized pretty early on in my education around franchising that actually he was talking a load of rubbish and franchising was going to be a hard slog for him. However, I also noticed that there was this gaping opportunity for my business. As I walked around, I saw franchise lawyers and I saw franchise marketing consultants. I saw all sorts of different advisors. And I saw one firm of accountants, and I think it was Price Bailey, who are, they're a really good firm. But I went over to them and asked them about what they do in the franchising space. And I thought, hang on, we do that at the moment. The stuff that they were doing was fairly general accountancy, and they were using franchising as a channel. And I was mulling it over in my mind as to how, as a business, how we could utilize the hub and spoke relationships that franchisors and franchisees have, and look at how we could systemize what we could do, how we could really take advantage of the fact that there's 100 businesses that all look like each other, and what can we add to that equation that provides some value. So that seed had kind of set in my mind back in 2004, and that was my first introduction to franchising. I then just carried on turning up to the events and learning and meeting people and so on. And we started to take on a few franchisor clients. Some of them were good, some of them were bad, some of them were extremely ugly, to be honest. When I say franchise, I use the term very loosely. Sometimes it was a back of a fag packet agreement. Sometimes they were quite professional. One of the professional ones that we took on was a brand called Stagecoach Theatre Arts, which I'm sure most of you have heard of. And it was during the conversations with Stagecoach that we realized that actually there was something that we could offer in this equation. At the time, we believed it was all around tax. And I won't bore you with the details of Stagecoach's unique circumstances, but they wanted somebody to basically monitor the tax affairs of their franchisees and to make sure that it was all clean. At that time, there was a legal case going on with Subway, and Subway had some of their franchisees who were doing their VAT in one way, some in another way. And the fear that Stagecoach had was that the approach that HMRC took with Subway would be replicated across the franchising industry. What had happened with Subway was that the taxman had picked on one of the franchisees who was doing it badly, presumed that all of the Subway franchisees were doing it, and then extrapolated the results of their inspection across the whole network. So anyway, we got into Stagecoach and started on this process of monitoring and normalizing the franchisees' tax affairs. And that was when the penny dropped, because we realized at that point that we actually had more access to the data of the franchise network than anybody else. We knew more about an individual location, let's say the franchisee in Milton Keynes. We knew more about their business. We knew more about the wider network. We knew more about the hundreds of other franchisees that looked like them. And we knew more about the consolidated position than anybody in the country. Franchisees didn't know it, franchisor didn't know it. And the reason why they didn't know it was because the data flow between franchisee and franchisor was as it always had been. Send us the annual accounts 3 months after the year end, and the usual things that are just put into franchise agreements. So with Stagecoach, we actually trialed the use of online accounting. So this was before it became something that was relatively mainstream. We put it in the mid-2000s for them. It was a really clunky, horrible system, but it allowed us to see what was going on the ground at each individual franchisee location. We reported back to head office with benchmarking and so on. And we found that over time, our conversation shifted from talking to franchisees about stuff like how should they put their company car through the books and so on, actually to how am I performing versus other franchisees? What can I do better? What are you seeing across the other franchisees? The tone of conversation changed from a conversation about compliance and getting the tax correct to a conversation about really supporting the franchisees and providing them with anonymized feedback across the network and using the power of the 99 other businesses that look like theirs. So that was the tipping point. That was the light bulb moment where we saw that there was something there. And then from that point, so that was 2007 through to about 2012, that was when we had probably our most rapid growth in terms of onboarding franchisors, really testing this concept, this idea, to see whether it can go from something that seemed like a good idea in my mind and work for one business, actually could it work for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 franchisors, and seeing the good, the bad, and the ugly along the way. So what I want to do is just to share with you some of those observations, what we saw, some of the challenges that we saw franchisors coming up against, and the kind of stuff that we've been doing to try and move it along. The big thing that was common across pretty much all networks was that regardless of the technology they used, because by 2012, you had some networks who were trying to put in the software themselves, whether it was a franchise-specific bit of kit, whether it was an off-the-shelf package like Xero or QuickBooks, or whether it was even through the back end, through something like Salesforce or Dynamics. The big challenge was that there was always a bit of a black hole in the information. And there was a bit of a blockage between what franchisee was prepared to tell Big Brother and what franchisor wanted to know. And I guess that the challenge that was inherent there was that franchisee wanted it to be their business. They wanted to keep their affairs to themselves and it's my business, I can choose what car I buy and so on. And franchisor generally, 9.5 times out of 10 wanted this information to help their franchisee, not to beat them up with a stick. Despite what franchisees think, that's really what I saw. The franchisees were scared that it was going to be used as a tool against them. Franchisors wanted to support. And we found that the information that was flowing up to head office was just like comparing apples and oranges. There was no consistency of the way that things were produced. And whilst on the face of it, these management printouts might have come from the same systems, actually the way that the data was put into the systems and the methods that the franchisees used to allocate costs, the methods that they used to provide that information was different. So you could have two franchisees performing identically well, but one of them's driving a Fiat, one of them's driving a Ferrari. Guess which one's going to be loss-making? We also observed that there was a very real difference in what the franchisor was providing from a franchise management perspective and what the franchisee could really benefit from. So what typically happened in our experience was that a network would be split. You'd have 20% at the top, you'd have 20% of the bottom, and then you'd have a mass in the middle. And the approach to franchise management was actually very checklist focused, very manual, and it was effectively replicating the stuff that computers could do. So rather than sitting down and having productive conversations with franchisees, we saw that franchisors were instead, ticking a box. Is your menu on the wall correctly? Yes, it is. Is it in brand colors? Yes. Are the golden arches golden or are they green? They're golden. Have you submitted your financials? Yes. Have you submitted your operations reports? Yes. And the management process was more about compliance with the process rather than actually looking at what's there and how can it be improved on. So we focused very much on the key pillars of transparency, consistency, and benchmarking, making sure that there was transparency in that relationship, as franchisors are entitled to have through their franchise agreement, making sure that there was consistency in approach, in reporting, that you could look at 2 reports from 2 different franchisees, regardless of who they are, and it's consistent. And that there's a benchmarking process so that franchisees can take advantage of the accumulated knowledge and data from other franchisees to implement best practice. How do we do that? We built our own in-house tool, Franchise Dashboard, which allowed us to consolidate information, identify high flyers, and so on. But it was all about moving that relationship and that those sticky conversations around finances, those sticky conversations around performance, from a conversation about the stick to a conversation about the carrot and how it can be improved. One of the challenges, and I'm absolutely certain that I can say that it doesn't apply to anyone on this call, but one of the challenges in franchising in general that I saw was that sometimes there was an obsessive focus over MSF rather than franchisees' unit level economics, rather than franchisees' individual performance. And this came about through a few brands that we spoke to, and really the entire reason for them being in franchising, and more to the point, the entire KPI set that they had was on how many new franchise units can they sell and how much MSF can they take as quickly as possible before replacing. And the models were more of a churn model. They were based almost on franchisee failing and being replaced with a new healthy fee, rather than franchisees being successful. So one of the core, I guess, ethoses that we've had in managing franchisees' affairs and the use of this data is to try and understand what works at franchisee level. Because invariably, I say 9.5 times out of 10, franchisor is a good guy or a good lady. They want to do the right thing. They want to help their franchisee. But also, invariably, 9.5 times out of 10, the person dealing with a franchisee hasn't been a franchisee themselves. If they've been on the tools, they haven't done it for 10 years. And that's just the reality of scaling an organization and focusing on building a franchise rather than building an independent location. So what we've tried to do through the data, and where I see this stuff going forwards as well, is trying to get a true observation of what's going on the ground day in, day out, rather than the presumption that the ops manual built 10 years ago still works, but also trying to identify the relationship between activity and results. So we all know, if we were to take a very flippant example here, we could look at retail. Now, if you set up a retail unit in your spare bedroom, the likelihood is whatever you're selling, widgets or whatever, you could have maybe one person walk down your road who would be interested in buying, but you're not going to get the footfall. So that unit, that cost, that investment in your business is below the optimum point. On the flip side, if you've got these widgets and you're selling them from units that are the size of Debenhams, there's loads of them empty now, the likelihood is that premises are going to be too big. The sweet spot is somewhere in the middle. And that sweet spot changes over time. And the sweet spot that we learn as franchisors when we're growing the business isn't necessarily the sweet spot for the franchisees 10 years down the line. So by using data, we can identify, for example, with marketing, we can identify that there's no point dropping 10 leaflets because you're not going to get a single customer from it. It's a waste of 10 leaflets and a waste of energy. There's no point dropping 200,000 leaflets because you're going to drop 4 leaflets through everybody's door in your area. Actually, the sweet spot is 20,000 leaflets for the return. And understanding that sweet spot and the correlation between activity and results is a really powerful tool that can, I believe, help improve the relationship between franchisors and franchisees, and really prevent franchisees from having to find this out themselves 100 times over in 100 different territories. So that was just one of the areas where the data really could help a franchisor make informed decisions. Where do we see it in the future? One of the things that deeply, deeply frustrates me about franchising is the fact that national franchises are unfairly crippled versus corporately owned national businesses. So national franchises are discriminated against when it comes to grants and so on, because they're deemed to be large businesses. However, when it comes to your franchisees buying their mobile phone contracts or utility bills and so on, they're dealt with as small businesses by the suppliers. There's unfortunately no ability to take advantage of the economies of scale in every area that a corporate business can, whereas you get penalised for being a big business through the campaigns like Shop Small and so on. So one of the areas that I see where the data can help us as franchisors here make, create more opportunity and cost savings for our franchisees is through bulk buy-in. So to understand exactly where your franchisee's spend is. If you've got 10 franchisees with Vodafone, you've got 50 with EE, you've got 20 with O2. I don't care where they are. It's probably a bit all over the place. To actually be able to have that data to have the conversations with the vendors and to hold their feet to the fire, you can get a better outcome for your franchisees. And that can be done across all of your vendors. The next one I see is funding. I still believe, even though we get advantageous funding in the franchising world, I don't believe it's anywhere near as advantageous as it should be. Because let's be honest, most people who go for bank funding are starting up an independent business, and we know the failure rates of independent businesses versus franchises. With franchises, there's a proven model, there's proven results. There are, for franchisee number 101, there's 100 case studies before that can demonstrate how it's going to be repaid, the risk and so on. So I believe that down the line, this kind of data can be used for helping the banks make more intelligent decisions on how much capital contributions needed, on repayment terms, and also the pricing of that debt. But ultimately, where I see the future of this is helping franchisors streamline their franchise management process, so that rather than sitting down with those boring tick lists and just checking for compliance as Big Brother, franchisors can shift that relationship to being the supporter, to actually helping their franchisees create a better business. Because MSF, it pays for today's bills as a franchisor, but a profitable franchisee pays for tomorrow's MSF. So guys, listen, that's just my views, I guess my rant about my worldview on franchising and data. I think there's a wealth of opportunity for franchisors if they manage it correctly. I know that it's not anywhere near as easy as a task as it might seem. So that's probably a good point, Julie, to just throw the floor open for some questions.
Thanks, Carl. Yeah, great. That was absolutely amazing. Yeah, really interesting. I have one question, but also there was a question that came in through the chat room, and it was basically for the newbies on the call, the MSF, which is management services fee, which, as the established franchisors know, is the main income that franchisors gain from their franchisees. So it is the percentage normally that people take. My question, Carl, was just to begin with, was around, you mentioned franchise dashboard, and is that a product? And interestingly, we have a product called Franchise Base, and Franchise Base is about posting manuals and training and all the kind of training induction and training management for franchisees. So franchise dashboard, can you just give a little bit more information about that in terms of its functionality?
Yeah, of course. So Franchise Dashboard was a tool that we built because we couldn't buy one off the shelf. We looked around, we couldn't find it. What we wanted was a tool that stopped our teams having to create an Excel spreadsheet and manually key in numbers every month to send to Stagecoach to show the benchmarking of how their franchisees have been performing. So we wanted to find a way to automate that. We wanted a system that, and it's still very much in development. We wanted a system that could rank franchisees on financial performance, could flag up to franchisors if you've got a franchisee who's significantly overdrawn or similar. For the key warning signs where you think, actually, I need to step in now to help this business. They've buried their head in the sand, and we can actually have a productive conversation to help them before there's an issue. So we couldn't find that on the market. It's effectively a conduit between the accounting tools for licenses that the individual franchisees have. It joins it up and puts it in one place for franchisor. How we do that legally and from a permissions perspective, as accountants, we obviously act for the franchisee, but we make sure on the engagement letter that we've got authority to request information from and disclose information to the franchisor. So that's how we cover it off. Franchisors typically have a clause that they can have access to the financial records within the franchise agreement as well. So it's a legitimate system to have in place. Where we see it going forwards is ultimately allowing franchisees to an extent to self-serve on some basic things. So if they want to know roughly where they stand in terms of their revenue compared to the rest of the network, but they'd be able to find it and so on. So there's a whole host of things that we think down the line can be baked into this. But ultimately at the moment, it's a portal for franchisor to be able to go in and see live data today where their franchisee is.
Great, super. During the session, I just actually put everyone on mute. So feel free to unmute yourself and feel free to ask any questions, start asking any questions that you'd like to ask either directly or put it in the chat box. I do have one more question again. I know I said I had one, but I have two actually. The franchisors that work with you, Cod, do they tend to have a clause in their agreement whereby all of their franchisees have to work with you, or is it for the franchisees to decide how, and if they've got a clause in the agreement, how is that received by the franchisees?
Very, very good question. So we have those with a clause, we have those with a strong recommendation, we have those who take a bunch of leaflets from us and don't do anything with it. The problem with any system is that the moment there's an exception in the system, then you've got a weakness, and you can pretty much guarantee that the exception from the system is where it falls down. We naturally prefer to be in the agreement because it gets it straight from day one. And it also avoids the pain of trying to retrofit this kind of process into an established network. The challenge with retrofitting it in is that franchisee has got their local high street accountant, or has got maybe a family friend or family accountant, whoever it is, they've got somebody in place. And because they're not so motivated in the buying process at that point, they will have the very valid question from their perspective: why should I change? Why should I do this? It's benefiting you, not me. So yeah, we are advocates of having it in from day one where possible. In terms of answering that question, there's a few easy ways of answering it, because once you've got traction in the network, the network accountant would undoubtedly know more about the network than the accountant they're currently using, and in theory that should put more pounds, shillings and pence on their bottom line. In terms of whether it can be in the agreement or not as well, because that's another question that you didn't ask, Julie, because yes, I would say about half of our networks have us in the agreement, but there is a question that is quite a valid question as to whether legally you can put it in the agreement. And I know some lawyers are a bit concerned about it, and others are very confident that you can. We believe, based on the legal advice we've taken, that it can be covered under the EU block exemption for vertical agreements. It's been a few years since I've said that. However, some lawyers take other views. Some believe there needs to be more than one provider. But we see that the franchise dashboard and the system that goes in should be integral to the operation of a franchise model. So, is it in the agreement? It should be. That's the ideal way, Julie. But yeah, we do go everywhere from people with it in the agreement through to people who take the literature and don't do anything with it.
Super, great, thank you.
Julie, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Ken.
We've just done that with a client that needs help, or the franchisee need the sort of dashboard information that Carl's been talking about. And what we've done is put the accountant in as a nominated supplier, and the franchisees have to use the accountancy firm for 12 months. And then after that, it's open. So we're hoping, expecting that once the relationship's established, it will continue. So that's been our approach.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks, Ken. Okay, guys.
Yeah, so I was just going to word of a voice of caution on that, Ken. So we've tried that with a few brands, and in particular, when it doesn't necessarily work, and where we found problems is when franchisor pays for it on behalf of the franchisee as well. When that relationship is forced, what we found is that franchisees almost look for a reason to get out of that arrangement. And then the challenge that brings is, whilst it works for year one, year two onwards, they're outside of the system. So actually, I think that, and again, just based on us having done this with, quite literally, we've worked with, it's probably now the brands we've worked with, as well as the brands we work with currently, we're probably now in hundreds rather than over 100. What we've seen is that the franchisee has to actively engage in that decision. If you don't get that engagement, then they just look for the way to escape the system.
Right, okay, we'll bear that in mind, thanks.
Cool. So, there's a question from Marianne, Judy. Do you want me to cover that one off?
Yeah, please, I haven't seen that.
Yeah, so Marianne mentioned benchmarking. What areas would you prioritise to benchmark? I think that's a really good question. It really depends business to business, and you need to look at the core business that you've run. When you were running it either as a company-owned operation or as a pilot, what were the key factors in that business? Very typically, you want to be looking at ideally activity levels on marketing as well as marketing spend, because we know that ultimately it's the activity that's key. You'll want to be looking at anything that can impact what I call big numbers in the P&L, so anything that impacts the gross profit margin. But really, it's about keeping it down to, for me, I tend to focus when benchmarking any business, whether it's franchised or non-franchised, to very simple KPIs that are quite easy to pull up and give a clue to an underlying challenge. So, for example, what I do in my own business in D&T is we monitor 3 key numbers on the financials. We monitor our turnover, we monitor our gross profit, we monitor our total overheads. If one of them's out of kilter, we dive in deeper and then try and work out why it is and fix it. Likewise, if we were looking at our customers, we look at net promoter score, we look at churn rates. We focus on very big abstract numbers. And if it goes slightly out of our range that we'd expect, we can then dive in again. So with benchmarking, I would say I can't tell you exactly what numbers to focus on, what areas to prioritize, but I would say keep it simple, keep it manageable, have some headlines that are non-negotiables. And then when you see those go out of kilter, that's when you do your deep dive. That's when you look at 20 numbers rather than 3.
Thanks, Carl. That's really good. How often would you do that?
So again, good question. I think that the balance you want to strike here is making sure that you're not over-engineering the end product, because I guess there'll be some businesses where daily might be necessary, but I also guess it's probably not necessary in your business. However, leaving something quarterly might be too late. So if you've got a system that provides the data, you absolutely can do it daily, or you could do it weekly or monthly. I think the key is knowing those numbers that you want to focus on and having that set process so that you don't forget to do it this month, and then forget to do it next month, and then the system's lost along the way. So yeah, don't over-engineer it. I don't think it's a daily process, but Certainly monthly, I would suggest for most businesses.
Thank you.
Can I just jump in there on benchmarking, because we do it for our franchisees. It's Catherine at Revive here. We also we benchmark stuff that we want to know, obviously, but we also benchmark a few of the costs, the key costs in the business, so that franchisee can easily see, you know, if they're paint and consumables for us, we do minor paint repairs on cars. If they're higher than sort of 7 to 10%, then either one of their techs is doing some work on the side, or they're not controlling their costs in some way. And salaries and bonuses are another figure that we use. So as well as you're offering value for to the franchisees as well as to us in terms of controlling their figures. So that can be quite useful when you've got all the figures for all the franchisees, just to look at what you think should be the right level of cost percentage, and giving them that information can be quite useful as well.
Definitely. This is the difference between a good and a great franchisor. And I'm not blowing smoke there, Catherine. Seriously, the good franchisor focuses on the MSF and makes sure there's enough of a franchisor to survive. The great franchisor makes sure their franchisees are as profitable as they can be. Because the moment that you help them with that, they see a very real tangible value in the franchise fee, because the perception of value drops over time. When they sign up, they think you're God's gift to business. You are the greatest person in the world. You are the master. Once they've read the ops manual, once they've done it over and over again, they think, why on earth am I paying franchisor this money? The thing is, if they're doing it on their own, they're battling blind. If they haven't got the support behind them, as a independent non-franchise business, they've got to work it all out for themselves, and they've got to take the hit on spending more money on paint and so on until they realise that they've been being ripped off or they've got too much wastage. So having franchisor in their corner, helping them with that based on what the rest of the network's doing, is a really powerful place for a franchisor to be. It helps them be profitable, but also it's a hook to retain them as well.
Thank you.
Carl, can I ask, with your in-house systems, how much access to the data across a network would a franchisee have, and how much time would you suggest is the balance between franchisees working stuff out for themselves or having it pointed out to them by the franchisor from the central data that they can see?
Sure. So in terms of franchisee access, at the moment, they have none. And it's something that I can't share too much about where we're going with this, but we're having a focus group of franchisors to help us understand what the balance is across franchisors in terms of what they feel comfortable with franchisees having and positive, and actually what could be challenging for them to have for the franchisees to have access. There's also issues we have from our regulation in terms of there's certain things from a confidentiality perspective that we can't share. So it's about finding that right balance for all parties, and a very realistic possibility is that there's boundaries, so minimum and maximum, and then franchisor actually sets where it is. Because I've got a feeling at the moment that franchisors will have differing views from network to network. So at the moment, none. Going forward, we don't know, but we think there's going to be some. In terms of the time input of franchisees updating the system rather than being pointed by franchisor, at the moment, the franchisees know that the dashboard exists, but they don't actually have an interface into it. Their interface is their bookkeeping system and any other systems we decide to plug in. So it's not a separate tool for them to use. It just takes the data from tools that in theory they should be using already.
Okay.
Oh, can I ask that, do you mean that they have, do they have access to their own data? But
Yes.
But obviously they don't have access in terms of any visibility of anyone else's data.
Absolutely right. So they have access to their own data because it's their own bookkeeping. That data is owned by them legally. What they don't have access to in any way, shape or form is the wider network. And the debate we have, and where we're taking counsel from various franchisors, is whether there's value to franchisees having access to anonymised benchmark performance.
Okay, and Rick, when you asked the question, did you mean in terms of the franchisee having access to their own data and being spoon-fed more information about their own business, or were you talking about the wider network?
The wider network, because I often question the validity or the authentic. I guess where I'm looking at with this is that when you start putting up league tables for franchisees, is that good, bad, or indifferent? Do the good ones kind of wander around crowing about it? Do they then start to have a pop at the lesser performing ones? I'm always a little bit wondering about the benefits of the league tables. However, we are always trying to teach the franchisees of how to do stuff for themselves, particularly when it comes to running the business. They all teach each other about how to be bloody good at cleaning ovens. That's great, that's fine. But actually getting them to understand the basics about how to run a business and just soppy bits and pieces, differentiating between gross and net profit, for example. We're always actively trying to help them to teach themselves how to understand this stuff and how to benefit from it. So I was more thinking there with Carl's system, if they could look to see some of the kind of basic KPIs of where they sat, not necessarily who's paying the most MSF or who's the golden balls that particular month. It's more of, just working through the advantageous bits and the benefits and so forth, and equally working out what the negatives are going to be, because as Carl rightly says, if they can find a negative and they can find a way of bailing out of something that's been imposed upon them by the franchisor, they're over it like a rash.
Yeah, and the problem you got is their people. Let's be honest, they're people, and people are all different. And we've seen this ourselves with our employee league tables that we tried and we actually ditched after a while, because we had people who became super motivated by being top of the table. We had people who didn't care where they were. We had people who were embarrassed to be in the top 5. We had people who said they didn't care but were bitterly frustrated and demotivated. We had people who said they didn't care, who were bitterly motivated and were really angry, but it actually drove them to be top of the table afterwards. And then with franchising, you've got this other dynamic as well, but you've got existing franchisees going for 4 years and is at $1 million turnover, but actually they're lagging in terms of what they should be doing compared to newly motivated franchisee who's maybe starting from a much smaller base, but the percentage increase is much better. So I'm cautiously looking at league tables, because I see that there are pros to it, but there's also a lot of potential challenges that come out of it, even just when you look at the difference between pounds and percentages.
Yeah.
Can I just, sorry, I was just going to say, I've come from an industry where league tables are everywhere in recruitment, right? And exactly what Carl said there, everybody's different and have different motivations. I personally think that the league tables can be really good, but if it's combined with coaching from the franchisor or from the leader to actually say, okay, so you bottom, well, look, what can we do to turn that around? So it can actually be good for them to get a dose of realism, but also actually let's take some steps together to move things forwards, and with each individual, you need that individual response, not just post it up there and then everyone have their reactions. I think you've got to support them through that. So my caution would be, it might just cause a lot more kind of work internally for a franchisor, and therefore do you need an extra resource to help kind of manage that? And that'd be my thoughts around it.
Yeah, I agree entirely, Ed. And what we're trying to do with our system and where we're going with it as well is to ultimately reduce the data collection and the administration that franchise managers have to do to free them up to do this stuff. Whether they are the right people to do it is a different matter. I've seen, again, the good, the bad, and the ugly of franchise managers. I've seen various levels of experience, various levels of ability, and so on, because it's a very different role going from somebody who's checking for compliance to somebody who's coaching a business owner to help them grow. That's two very different personalities. But if we can give the tools to franchisors, then that's the first step in that process.
I've actually seen league tables work with Dynarod, and they do have a very structured, league table system, and they literally have platinum, premiership, championship. Now, my perception in terms of my understanding was from the franchisor's perspective, and from the franchisor's perspective, their view is it worked very well, and they literally gave high levels of support to the platinum group because they were the real big hitters. There was also the argument that actually needs are different in terms of business support. So if you've got a business turning over 10 million and a business turning over 500,000, you've potentially got two different beasts and animals. So my experience from that was it's not just about having the league tables, it's about having the infrastructure and support behind that to make sure that you're giving the right and relevant support to that group. But certainly from their experience, and when I was involved with them, the league tables were up and running, and they weren't just being introduced. Introducing something new is always the challenge. But anyone that joined the network joined knowing that that was the system. But it basically meant it did motivate franchisees to want to stay within the platinum group. And they said when there was someone came to the bottom of the platinum group, they would work really hard to make sure that they were moving back up. So they were, I think they relegated and promoted basically. So it was quite savage in terms of the use of it, but it was a system that was up and running, and the franchisees appeared to accept it.
So we were involved in Dynarod, and we put our systems in. So I can't mention anything because of client confidentiality. On a entirely unrelated note and a different client, what I would suggest is that if you consider doing this for an existing network, not to use it as a stick for those who are maybe not at platinum status. Instead, what we find is generally the top 20%, bottom 20%, and the block in the middle, that also tends to reflect the attitude towards franchisor. With a few exceptions, but the 20% at the top are normally, whilst they might be critical, they're critical friends, and it's with good intent. The bottom 20% are looking for their way out of the agreement. And on that basis, it's normally best, if you're looking to implement any sort of change, whether it's this or anything else, is to work with the top 20% first.
Catherine, I think Revive maybe have some form of, I'm not sure if it's a league table, but grouping system.
Yeah. We do. We group the franchisees. So there's a little raft of single van franchisees who shouldn't actually be there because it's a management franchise. We have 2 to 4 vans, so they've got 2 to 4 technicians working for them. And then we've got 5+, and then we've got a little group in that 5+ that are bigger, so they've got 10. So we have different groups of league tables, but there's a couple of things that we do. We don't show the bottom. So even the top group league tables, it's the top 10 or the top 15. And then you're not showing the poor figures to shame anybody, but you're giving them the notice that they're not in that top group. And we have a range of things that we group the league tables on. So obviously sales figures are very key, but also percentage increase and pounds. So we show both, but we also show how much of that business they grow themselves locally, because we've got a national accounts program. So if they've got huge growth figures, but it's all delivered by us, then that's not so good. So they've got a local business. And then we also do a customer service league table as well. We've got it's a bit of manual work for us, but we track it all anyway. We've got a pro Trustpilot license, and we can allocate some scores, and we monitor SLAs for the national account work. So we league table them on customer service as well. So you do tend to sometimes get a few different names in, and there's a few different things for people to aspire to. And then the smaller group, we don't actually league table. They need to engage. The training is all open for them. They can do it all with us, but we don't force them to do it. So it's just trying to use it as a positive rather than a negative, if that makes sense.
Right, thank you. We're now open to the floor for any and all questions. So by all means, feel free to continue firing questions at Carl, or alternatively, if anyone's just got a general question that they'd like to ask, the floor is open.
Just a general point. on the aspect of KPIs and dashboard. One of the franchises I was involved with years ago, one of the key performance indicators was cost of sale. We didn't have league tables, but what we did have was a monthly review, and each month we could work out what the national average cost of sale was, or even regional, and we used to send that to the franchisees so that they could compare their KPIs specific with the national or regional average, and that used to work quite well, actually.
Yeah, I think it's information that an independent business wouldn't have, and this is one of the powers of franchising, because an independent business, you know, if let's say an independent Revive business, you know, an independent paintwork company would have no idea what the industry gross profit should be. They'll have a gut feel based on people they've worked for before and what they think the market rate is that they can sell for and what they're being offered for product for, but they don't know for certain that that's right. And yeah, for any businesses, certainly supplying product, it's a key number. But again, I wouldn't league table it either, but I would probably look to have tolerances. And you know, if gross profits expected to be 30%, have a tolerance of 27 to 32. And if it shifts outside of that banding, you dive in job by job and find out where the problem is.
It's as we've been introducing increase. I mean, I got into franchising. I bought a franchise because I wanted to benchmark my other business, you know, with competitors, and nobody told me what was going on in their business. You know, they wouldn't tell me what their margins were and so on. So I bought a franchise. But as we've introduced more and more KPIs and more of a dashboard on the operational side of our business, what we found is that the people who are engaged in that and are engaged and excited by KPIs look at it all the time and get motivated by it because they want to move up and down the league, or they don't want to move down, they want to move up the league table. And the people who aren't kind of competitive in that way tend not to look, but the information is available to us to then use to coach and to help folks, and to say, well, you know, it's not about just doing more marketing activity, but it's about, if you did this much more marketing activity, then these are the results you can get, because these are the results that all people get. What I think is interesting to talk about cost of sales is that that's the big difference on the financial figures. And I'm fascinated by your financial dashboard that allows you to compare the numbers, because I mean, our business, our predominant cost of sales is labor, and some accountants will put that as a direct cost, and some will see it as an overhead cost. So actually, you know, we've got some businesses making, you know, 88% gross profit, and we've got others doing 40. And it's very hard to compare because of the lack of consistency.
Yeah, this is it. This is where you get to a situation where you can't compare apples with apples. And it really is important. I mean, this is business 101. I'm not teaching any of you anything new here, but ultimately profit is what you want your franchisees to be getting. And there's two numbers that come into that: their revenue and their costs. And all too often, franchisors focus on the revenue and kind of let the costs sort themselves out. If you can give them just some benefit of a wider network experience and data on that side as well, it can only help the final number.
Carl, do you have any experience of franchisors, if they don't, you know, use that kind of system, but giving franchisees some form of pro forma for how they want their accounts to be produced? So obviously Chris has just said he's got franchisees doing things in two entirely different ways. If there's some pro forma to say, this is what we want you to do, it doesn't matter who you use to do it, but this is how we want you to present your accounts.
Yeah, so absolutely all franchisors should be doing that. So whenever we take on a network, we set up what's known as a chart of accounts and a structure for the reporting to come out and so on. The challenge with that is us accountants think we know best. And you can provide a pro forma, but if the accountant thinks it should be above the line or below the line, they will put it there regardless of the pro forma that's given. And also the varying attitudes on the way things should be treated and so on. So yes, you can give a pro forma. Obviously, it goes without saying, Julie, I'm going to say it's far better to get a network accountant in place, but you know I'm going to say that. So take that with the pinch of salt as necessary. But yeah, the pro forma definitely steers it in the right direction, but doesn't guarantee that it's going to be consistent when it comes out.
Thank you. Okay. Does anyone have a last one or two last burning questions they'd like to direct either at Carl or at anyone else, or in any open questions at the end of the session today? In which case I'm going to stop the recording.